This season of How's That Working for You is really focused on lived and living experience. One of the real struggles of bringing particularly the lived experience of trauma to light is how to combine writing the truth of experience, whatever that may be, in a trustworthy way and combining that with what we understand, the research about the body, the mind, and the social reproduction of trauma in a way that doesn't either erase individual experiences or let our cultures off the hook. Meera Atkinson is a poet, a fiction and nonfiction writer, and a trauma scholar. She's the author of several books and many pieces of fiction and nonfiction. But we're talking particularly today about her book, Traumata, which is an exploration of trauma and its long-lasting effects through the lens of neuroscience, an analysis of patriarchy, and a deeply moving and reflexive memoir. Meera and I have been friends for decades, and we've shared our own efforts to heal and manage the impacts of our childhood traumas. Between us, we've tried almost everything. And I'm not saying it that way to say we failed. I don't think we failed, but I think we both have a really nuanced understanding of how trauma operates socially, in the body, and interpersonally, and the inevitable challenges and limits in treating trauma. We also share a deep trust in the importance of systemic and transgenerational understandings of trauma. Meera writes this: I have to speak from the inside out because patriarchy isn't out there. Our skin is not an impenetrable barrier against its effects. It infiltrates our beings and shapes our lives, first from the outside and then from the inside out. I can't wait for you to share our conversation. And please check out Meera's book, Traumata. The link is in our show notes, and the reviews are stellar. Her newest poetry collection, Some Letters Take a Lifetime, which explores the transformative process of traumatic growth, will be published by Upswell in 2027. I really wanted to start with you telling us a little bit about who you are and what do you do?
In terms of my in the world identity, what I've done the most for the longest is being a writer, a literary writer, and a poet. And somewhere along the way, kind of in this weird way that had like a decade in between, I entered academia. So I did my undergraduate degree way back in the 90s. Then I did a research master's, and then I guess almost a decade after that, I did a PhD in the Writing and Society Research Centre at Western Sydney Uni. And that's when I did, I guess my biggest body of work in terms of on trauma, interdisciplinary research, which did include literary writing as well, but a lot of interdisciplinary scholarly work. But I did hang up my scholarly hat a couple of years ago. So I'm a recovering academic and actually still recovering. I was really pretty burned out at the end of that. So yeah, I have sort of taken some time out for a couple of years, and most recently have gone back to my first love of poetry, which has been very exciting. And I've just finished a collection.
Good. And we will have a link to that in the show notes for people who are interested. I wanted to ask you because, part of the reason that you're here is your book, Traumata, and because we're really looking at this season at lived experience or living experience, and particularly of trauma. But I feel like we use that word over and over and over and over again. And so, like, I guess, as a survivor and as a trauma scholar, like, what's your definition? How do you talk about what is a trauma
Mm,
compared to
mm,
what's not a trauma, I suppose?
mm. Yeah, well, like most people, I think, most people who have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, I felt the effects of it long before I understood that, and long before I had any kind of real understanding or definition. Um, when I started work on my thesis, the fundamental definition of my work has been that basic understanding of trauma as a site of unregistered experience, where something has happened too fast, too violently, or too overwhelmingly to be registered and processed, which is a kind of, uh, well, as you know, it not only has effects on brain chemistry and neural pathways and nervous system, and literally, as kind of Oprah once famously said in the 90s, changes who you are in some
Mm,
way, certainly how you experience yourself in the world. But it also kind of traps it in the present. It means that distressing past experience can't settle into that. And it's not always distressing at the time, but the impact is really significant in trauma and somehow stays stuck. But interestingly, and over time, I think my personal experiential definition of it or understanding of it is more about um, as a force from the unconscious and subconscious that drives thinking, reaction, behaviors, and the way that that kind of crafts a life script in the affect theorist Sylvan Tompkins terms, or in more popular parlance, schemas. But but I prefer the psychoanalytic object relations theory way of approaching that because it allows for a lot more nuance and specificity in understanding how that works for a given person out of a given sort of family history.
mm. Something in what you've said there, well, a few things in what you've said there I find really helpful. And one is, just the sense when you're answering that question of how your definition has changed over time, or how, when we have been traumatized, or, I certainly would have met and maybe still would meet the criteria for CPTSD, and how we have to keep thinking about what does that mean? How do I want to think about it? Which way of looking at it is meaningful for me or
Mm,
makes sense of my experience?
mm. And for what purpose? Like when I have been doing scholarly work, you know, writing an academic book or an article, you kind of have to map it out for people who may not, especially when you do interdisciplinary work, for people who may not have a basic sort of concept of it. But the lived experience of it is, it's really, really different to that. And another thing I should add is that as a writer, as a literary writer and poet, one of the things, and also as a scholar writing on literature, um, another kind of definition is that I've been very interested in trauma as a story that wants to be told, but that resists sort of usual ways of expression or easy sort of communication and even narrative sense making. So yeah, I think that's another kind of definition, I think, really.
Mm. It's one of the things, that I think I really struggle with as a therapist in the kind of current climate is the way that not just the nuance, but the multiplicity of ways of seeing trauma, of understanding trauma, and of, I guess, the idea that it can be kind of pinned down like a
Mm,
butterfly under glass is,
mm,
I find that, troubling from both sides of the couch. And one of the things I really love about Traumata is not just those different perspectives, but also how many different approaches you've taken to your own so-called recovery
mm,
over the years. And it seems to me a much more realistic picture of recovery from childhood trauma, certainly one I, resonate with more. And so when we think about it that way, how how do you engage with this idea of what's changeable, what you want to change, what can be changed, like especially in that climate of
mm. I mean,
get
that's
better?
it's a tough question.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been so slow for me, so slow, and really not on my timeline. It's so not on my timeline. And I think there's a sort of difference between what you can do consciously at a conscious level to invite processing and healing, and what you just can't control, which is that unconscious aspect. Um, so I can think of, if I look back over my history, I can see some really key big steps that I took consciously that really, game change, really sped things up, really opened things up. Well, one was getting clean and sober at 24, having started drinking and using drugs problematically in my early teens. So that was a big shift, because once I stopped self-medicating, I couldn't not, meet the messengers of my trauma more, and the pain of that. And I think pain is important. Um, it's been one of my great motivators. Uh, the pain of that led me to invite other people into relationship with those messengers, like therapists and friends like you,
Mm.
you know, um, and because it's unbearable alone. It's simply unbearable alone. It's a team effort. For me, it always has been. I can't imagine a way in which it wouldn't be. But the readiness or the ability to sort of see certain things or meet certain things, that's not necessarily something I've had control over. I mean, I'm turning the corner now on things I started consciously, core trauma stuff that I started consciously trying to heal 35 years ago. I mean, it's humbling. It's a humbling process. And it's not, I'm not a patient person, but I have had to learn patience and get better at that. And commitment is really important. And I haven't always been committed. I've had periods of wanting, periods of getting jack of it, and like, I've done enough. And I want a holiday. Why haven't I graduated? Whatever. But clocking off. I've had periods of clocking off because it's just been too hard to stay the course in a very sort of on committed way. But thankfully, I come back. I always come back. And each time I come back, it seems like it's at a different level. But it's not for the faint-hearted. It's not for people who aren't willing to really sit with some very difficult and uncomfortable stuff.
Mm. I like, that does really fit my experience of my own, I don't know. I'm glad I'm glad we don't count up the money spent. Like that we it's just the time and not the money. But I like what you
Mm,
say about, yes, I can set an intention about what's causing me pain. What do I really want to shift? But do I really have control over when those windows are going to be open, or how open they're going to be, or how safe I am in my environment to be able to explore them? Those are all, much more difficult to control.
mm, And it's, that proverbial kind of peeling of the onion thing too. I think, that you, you can't kind of get beyond the layer that you're at. It's like that's,
Mm.
you work with the layer that you're at, and that's sort of as far as you can see at that point. Even if you know that there's more, it's a incredible process really, and not, but the one thing I've constantly had to accept and kind of re-accept is that it doesn't happen at the head level. It doesn't matter how much I've understood trauma, for increasingly I've understood
Mm.
a lot of the issues in my life and the challenges. I've understood what I've needed to change. I've understood all of that theoretically. That, remember that great t-shirt or something? It was that pop art kind of, I loved him in theory, but did I love him in practice? It was that sort of like, having the theory is
Yeah.
one thing, but the actual kind of lived experience practice, where you just feel things releasing, things shifting, things changing, like this kind of, and behaviors that would have seemed impossible, you know, a year ago or 5 years ago, suddenly are possible.
Mm.
So it's, yeah, quite the trip.
I like that you talk about patience too, because I think, sometimes, I don't know if it's like this for you, sometimes I will have a process now that I wanted to have, 20 years ago or
Mm,
something, and I'll think, oh my God, I don't think I could have borne that. I don't think I could have dealt with the consequences of that,
mm,
even though I thought I really wanted it and was working really hard
mm,
on it.
mm. And the other thing that amazes me is, I think, like at the moment, I've been reflecting on my life history with this stuff, because I've had some, pretty big breakthroughs recently. And, you can't help but wonder, like, why couldn't I have gotten this 30 years ago? Why, it was all there. The evidence was all, why why couldn't I have gotten this, but seeing that actually every single step along the way of not having got it was necessary to get it. Does that make sense? It's
Yeah.
like, oh, it's frustrating that it couldn't have happened sooner, but on another level, it's like this thing of really getting it that, yep, and it's absolutely like it had to happen
Mm.
the way that it did, and for as long as it did,
Yeah.
for me to be here,
Yeah.
now. So, I mean, and that's that sort of weird stuff that makes me think I'm not really somebody who believes in fate, or in the sense of, or who thinks that my life's path has been sort of charted ahead of time, or I resist those kinds of, I'm not a card carrying believer in that, but that sort of reflection makes me think, well, I don't know, like, it does make sense from this
Mm.
vantage point why it has happened that way.
Yeah. For, always retrospectively,
Yeah.
you know. And one of the things I really like when you're talking too is how you do what you do in the book so well, which is you go, meta and then to detail and then meta and to detail. And you offer this really big picture of the sort of context of intergenerational trauma, particularly though in terms of the patriarchal roots
Mm,
of our social structures and our institutions. I guess I'm really asking about how feminist theory helps because I wonder how does that translate for you into your like personal engagement with the impacts of your own traumas and understanding of them? How
Mm.
do you do that kind of meta micro?
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, thinking about trauma structurally and through a feminist lens has really helped me understand it deeply. And it's just sort of my nature to want to understand things deeply. But also, I think it's I think it's really helped my personal process because I just think about when I started my PhD, it was 2010. And when people would say, what are you doing? You know, what do you I'd say, oh, transgenerational trauma, and their eyes would just glaze over. It was really it's not that long. It doesn't feel like
Yeah.
that long ago, but people didn't really get it. And it's been so interesting to see over that period between then and now how much trauma, intergenerational, transgenerational trauma, etc., complex trauma, all these things have really entered public consciousness in a completely, in a major way, and that's great. But there's a sort of pitfall of that, which is that the danger is that people get stuck in these kind of they've learned about it. It's everywhere on the socials. They get stuck in these trauma silos, and it becomes this very kind of individualistic identity that, you know, at its worst becomes a kind of, trauma Olympic syndrome. And I don't think that's helpful individually. And I don't think, and it does nothing to change things, you know, systematically. And as soon as I started really digging into my own trauma experience and history, and trying to understand it through kind of memoir and the interdisciplinary scholarship, it's so obvious. It's so obvious that it doesn't, it's not just individual, it's not just a particular family, it's a totally collective operation. And so, my interest became very much about in trauma as a social and political force operation, and how that works, because that's where we've got some not only power to change and prevent trauma where it's preventable, which is a lot of it, but a real responsibility to. And yeah, at that personal level, it's helped seeing it through that sort of structural feminist lens, because I think it helps, it's shame reducing, and it's forgiveness enhancing, in that when you understand your trauma in that context, it it's easy to see how you and everyone in your story was set up. And it's also easy to see how some people haven't had incentives, and this is very much in the cultural realm now, as well as my personal one, but some people don't have incentives to get help and heal, because they are enabled and falsely empowered to stay traumatized and do damage out of that. Yeah.
Mm. No, I think that's a really, that last point too of who is it that comes
Mm.
into treatment.
Hmm.
And there's a kind of an old saying in family therapy, and that it's actually the wellest person who comes in the family who gets into therapy.
Hmm. It's not the narcissist.
It's not, no, and that it's not, that as you say, the encouragement
Mm.
is there for particular people. Also, of course, the support is less there for some people than others, but that the trauma that is culturally enabled to kind of
Hmm.
reproduce is.
Hmm. Absolutely.
It feels to me too when you're talking like that it's there's so much focus on forgiveness. And I always think personally, how would I have ever forgiven either of my parents without a systemic lens.
Mm,
Like if I really had a view that they were individually totally responsible and contextual. I mean, how do you forgive anyone really without
mm,
that lens too?
mm,
Or even
mm,
understand them?
mm, mm. And it is, obviously important and less about the other person, more about, relief for yourself. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, and I mean that what you were just talking about, the wellest person coming to therapy. I'm not sure that I would have been considered the wellest person in my family. I was the one that,
But that's the
looked
cultural view as well, isn't it?
right,
Yeah.
right. I was the one that looked the messiest and in a sense that acted out, that was the one whose dysfunction was the most obvious. And but over time I've come to be so grateful for that. So yeah, it's one of those things that I think often the people who look the best are, at that sort of surface social level,
Mm.
are often the least healthy and the least likely to get any kind of help.
Mm. So that's such a good kind of, when you say that, I can feel too, just in myself, in the work I've done with clients, that when when you don't have that systemic lens, it's very easy to just collapse messy into, kind of a shameful, sick position.
Mm. Which is how it felt for years.
Yeah,
Yeah. And in certain family systems, people are very happy for one person to look like the problem
sure.
while
People are happy
everyone
for the
else.
dog to look like the problem.
Yeah.
Anyone. Um, but one of the things I was really driven to ask you to come on the show was also because you've been a client in many different therapies, and I've been a client in many different therapies, but I kind of lose my perspective, I think, being a therapist. Whereas, you talk in the book um, about your kind of search, your sort of process. It's not, in a way, unlike um, the years long process that Stephanie Fu talks about in her book, What My Bones Know. But I'm really interested in all that about what your ideas are about, what makes a good therapist, what characterized the good experiences for you and
Mm,
bad ones.
yeah. Well, I mean, I've had a few bad experiences very briefly. One was a psychiatrist who fell asleep in
Oh,
sessions.
Meera. God. I mean, it's a meme for for a
Yeah,
reason because it's so
yeah,
impactful. Oh,
yeah,
far out.
yeah. I mean, maybe he was just past retirement, you know, due date because he wasn't young and it was a 3 o'clock session. But nevertheless, the the best therapist I think I've known was in her 60s. And for me, age and life experience does matter, especially at this point as I mature. Um, and she just had this in, incredibly winning combination of real presence, high intelligence, and a deep heart, and really keen instincts.
Mm.
And she somehow, she was really good at sort of stopping the story in a way that didn't wasn't sort of silencing or shaming. And of just knowing, I think that the timing was really good of knowing the right moment to kind of intervene on the story and not let that keep being the focus. And I mean, it was so instant. like her kind of greatness as a therapist was so instant that I came out I came out of the first session and said to my husband, I've just seen the person I think is the best therapist I've ever seen. That was after one session. And I think, yeah, I prefer people who work eclectically. I tend not to see, I mean, I think I did see a Gestalt therapist once, or, I've seen some sort of specialist people that are just into one thing, that's the thing. But I, um, I think I prefer people that kind of work a bit more diversely. I do wish, like from this vantage point, I do wish that my previous therapists and that more therapists in general really understood cluster B personality disorders, because it turns out to have been a big part of my trauma history. And if somebody had helped me catch that earlier on, it might have saved me a few decades of being gaslit. but
Mm.
but I don't know even then, because it's so much about what I as a client bring, how I frame things. People can only work with that. And if you're doing a lot of protecting and a lot of wearing shame and blame, I don't know if even somebody with real insight into that would have picked up. But as it is, I had to kind of work that one out myself.
You know what really, because there's lots of research into, what makes for a good therapist, what makes for good therapy, but again, it's hard to translate it the way you've translated it there. And there's something you said that I think we don't talk about very often, which is how important it is to have intelligence.
Mm,
Carl Rogers said, we need to select therapists for kind of three things, intelligence and curiosity and empathy. And, what you said about interrupting the story. So many of us get training in, the story is not important. If we go back to what you said about, the experience of it rather than the thinking of it. But the story, you can't disrespect the
mm,
story.
mm,
And you
mm.
want to know your therapist gets the story.
Yes, yes. And you need to ride the story to a point where you can jump off it, or
Yeah.
move somewhere else. But you don't just, you know, snap your fingers and get there. The story is part of getting there, but it's that kind of on the part of the therapist, I think the wisdom to know when the moment is kind of right to encourage that shift.
Mm. Oh, thank you. I, I could go on, but we don't have license in this podcast to have sessions of an hour and a half. Um, yeah, that was very generous. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
This podcast is brought to you by the Karen Miller Institute. Karen Miller is founded on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge their deep and enduring connection to land, waters, and community. The legacies of colonization and the ongoing effects of institutional racism have enduring impacts on the mental health and well-being of First Nations people, and we hold this continuing dispossession in our minds and hearts as we explore the question of how to improve our work in the mental health field. Karen Miller is more than just a not-for-profit organization. It's a vibrant community of students, clients, staff, alumni, and generous donors. Our hearts beat for better mental health, which has driven us for over 60 years. At CMI, we believe in a dynamic interplay between training, research, and clinical practice. These three pillars form our triple helix: each strengthening and informing the other as a registered health promotion charity. We've been pioneers in counseling and psychotherapy in Australia, and our purpose is to enhance mental health through accessible psychological services and innovative professional education. That's where How's That Working for You comes in. This podcast is our way of sharing the extraordinary insights, anecdotes, and life lessons from the mental health field. We're pulling back the curtain to offer you a unique peek behind the scenes, aiming to deepen your understanding of this remarkable space. I'm a senior lecturer at CMI. I'm a feminist psychotherapist, supervisor, and researcher. I've worked in agencies and in private practice, and I've trained in a number of modalities, including emotion-focused therapy and existential psychotherapy, and I have a primary interest in anti-oppressive practice. Thank you for listening to How's That Working for You, a podcast for the therapy curious. This has been your host, Dr. Zoe Krupka. This podcast is a space for open conversations, but it's important to remember that what you're hearing are the personal experiences and thoughts of me and of our guests. While we're here to share insights, please don't take any of this as advice. We're all wonderfully unique, so if you have therapeutic concerns, it's best to chat with your healthcare professional. This podcast was brought to you by the Karen Miller Institute. For more information about our organization, the services we offer, and how to donate, visit our website at cmi.edu.au. You can find links and more information about each guest in our episode show notes. Find us on all major podcast platforms and stay tuned for more inspiring episodes.